So welcome to our webinar, The Effective International Supply Chain Management. My name is Richard Cook, and I'm a Business Development Manager for SEMLEP, who run these webinars on behalf of the whole ARC, the Oxford-Cambridge ARC. This is the final session of 11, would you believe, in terms of EU exit webinars, in partnership with OXLEP, Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority, New Anglia and the BBF Growth Hubs, all aimed at helping business improve the trading post the EU transition period. So I must welcome Andrea, who's run the 11 and has been a stalwart through the whole thing. And she works for Export Department, her own company. Andrea is a real authority on import and export, and if anybody's joined any of the other webinars, I think you'll totally and utterly endorse that. She's also, I've had the privilege of working alongside her for the EU exit surgeries that we've done on behalf of SEMLEP. So I'm not going to talk about Andrea as an international trade specialist or 24 years industry, fluent in French, or that you have an MBA, etc., because I think everybody knows your credentials. Andrea is going to give us a better understanding and how we can better manage the supply chain process today. The only other thing that I really need to do is remind you of webinar etiquette in terms of keeping your on silent, on mute, in terms of that will help a lot. But please do put your questions into the chat, and we will ask those questions and have a discussion around those questions at the end of the session. And I think there's quite an amount of time that we've actually got and available to actually deal with those questions or broader EU exit and Brexit and origins, etc., that you may have as this is the final wash-up session. So if I can hand over to Andrea.
Wonderful.
Good luck.
Thanks, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, very sad to say it is the last time I'll be talking to you, but as Richard said, this is a very short presentation by standards. Any of you that have joined some of my other ones, I apologise, it's time you'll never get back. I always go over the hour. But this is deliberately quite short because what I want to do with it being the last session is I want to hear from you all as to what pains and challenges you're facing now that we're living and breathing EU exit. So we're, 2 months in? So I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to use the latter part of the time that I've got with you to cover off any questions that you might have or any pains that you're experiencing, because there is quite a lot of pain out there at the moment, both within the UK and to be honest within the EU as well. But you know, the EU hasn't felt the full extent of pain because of our border operating model. Obviously we've got a phased approach to imports, so that won't really kick in until kind of like July, the beginning of July, when we start imposing the same kind of standards on them that we're having to meet on export at the moment. So it's a lot of pain. So if we can cover anything off after this very short presentation, then great. So the last one is effective international supply chain management, and it kind of just finishes off what we've been talking about so far. So I just really wanted to talk about what global supply chain management is in comparison to, you know, domestic supply, just cover off a little bit about past barriers to global supply, take a look at some specific sectors both globally and UK based that are dependent on effective supply chains, global supply chains. Touch a little bit on the importance of regulatory compliance and the increasing move towards sustainability in global supply chains as well. We'll touch a little bit on the advantages and the drawbacks or the limitations, and then of course the impacts we've had. Wow, it's been like a perfect storm 2020, wasn't it? Faced with EU exit at the end, but companies trying desperately to navigate their way through the COVID pandemic as well. So both of those have exerted significant influences on global supply chains and have resulted in a number of companies kind of taking a step back and reevaluating their supply. You know, we're experiencing some of that with EU exit at the moment, where we're mapping the flow of goods and understanding the complexities that EU exit has placed on those kind of supply chains. And we'll talk a little bit about future trends. We'll talk about resilience, which has obviously become paramount importance over the last year. Though anybody that had a global pandemic in their risk register, I take my hat off to them. I haven't seen many that would have quoted or prepared for something quite as devastating as COVID. And then we'll talk a little bit about optimizing supply chains, and then, like I say, we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. And hopefully, if you haven't come armed with questions, perhaps you can be thinking as I talk through the presentation of anything that's particularly relevant that you'd like me to cover off with you. Okay, so if you think about what is global supply chain management, so it really does what it says on the tin, to be honest. If you think about local supply chain, so where you're investing in a local supply chain, you're really looking to optimize suppliers that are local to you, local to your organization. And you know, you might have a particular passion for leveraging homegrown supply routes. So all of those suppliers feeding into your supply chain will be located within, you know, the country, or maybe even the region where your organization's based. Obviously, there can be clearer visibility throughout the whole supply chain, from raw material through to consumer, because it's local. You're not having to deal with those farther flung territories. And there's also been, you know, over recent years, a movement, you know, quite a substantial movement towards local supply. So we see it with food producers, for example, those consumers that are wanting to buy local brands to help support the local and small producers. There was research carried out in 2019 that said overwhelmingly some 55% of consumers wanted to be seen to be supporting local brands. And I think moving forward, you know, increased pressures, increased environmental pressures and regulatory frameworks may see local supply chains having a bigger part to play, because, you know, can we carry on having such complicated global supply chains that account for such a huge part of our carbon footprint? So something to bear in mind. But a global supply chain is really a supply chain that utilizes or takes advantages of low-cost country sourcing. So, you know, procures products and services for countries that might have lower labour rates or reduced production costs than those that they can find in the UK or in their domestic market. So the chain will usually flow from the buyer, so the UK company, and it'll span across several different supplier tiers, and those suppliers will be located in other overseas markets. So it really requires, at least in my experience over the years, it requires perhaps a greater level of research and planning and execution than local supply chain does. So you have to have visibility of the entire supply chain and understand how it will function as an integrated whole. And obviously, you know, you want to get those cost efficiencies, but you don't want that to be at the detriment of customer experience, which is obviously a big driver for repeat business and customer advocacy and you know, repeat business. So you know, companies that are looking to source globally are also wanting to perhaps increase the speed at which their products reach customers. So they want to expand their capacity so they can create more, they can get product to market quicker. But they also want to make sure that built into that global supply that they can deal with the increasing complexity of customer transactions and have a certain level of flexibility built into that supply chain. So if you think about it, it incorporates, managing that entire global supply chain. It involves a pretty significant network of suppliers, manufacturers, obviously warehousing capabilities, to make sure that those goods are sourced and supplied and produced and shipped in the right quantities and so on to the right locations at the right times, and that they're received in sound conditions, so there's no detriment to quality, if you like. So to achieve all that, you've got this incredible flow of information. So you've got, purchase orders, shipping notices, way bills and invoices. You've got, the purchasing of materials, so raw and finished goods. You've got the whole finance chain to think about as well. And it's all got to be really coordinated effectively. So that whole efficient global supply chain management requires reliable logistics, and essentially, and probably very importantly, low barriers to trade across countries and blocks. And that is certainly what we're seeing, in the aftermath of EU exit, is that those barriers have gone up quite significantly. And so they do impact our supply chains, where they're tightly integrated with the EU, as you would expect they would be, because we've been part of the same trading bloc. So we've been sourcing goods and selling goods within the bloc. So EU exit has definitely had an impact there. In terms of past barriers to effective supply chain, so or effective global supply, in the past, there perhaps hasn't been the flexibility within the supply chain. So, the inability for suppliers to be responsive and react, and react to change that happens throughout, market demands. So there's been perhaps a lack of supply chain flexibility. Delivery times have perhaps been a little bit too long. Companies involved in the supply chain may have had a lack of internal competencies to be able to deal with those kind of important partnerships, because that relationship management is absolutely imperative in effective global supply. So managing those relationships and having that transparency is absolutely essential to making it work well, as like an oiled machine. There's been quality production issues. So, we'll talk about China a little bit in a little while. China for a long time was perceived to be, the quality of the goods wasn't what it would have been in other markets. That has improved dramatically over recent years. But there are still some markets that, the perception is that their manufacturing is typically of lower quality. And obviously that has an impact on the customer experience, especially if you're selling a quality good, but you're actually delivering it, a lesser quality goods. Threat to intellectual property, that has been, a kind of drawback. So, sourcing goods from those regions or sharing data with those regions where their IP protection perhaps isn't what it is in other economies may have prevented some companies from looking towards global supply. And, when you kind of do the calculations and see what the cost efficiencies are or the cost reductions, perhaps the saving hasn't been great enough to warrant you investing in developing that global supply chain. And then regulatory compliance issues we'll come on to in a second, but they are a major consideration where you have a supply chain that's spanning several different blocks and several different countries. And we've covered some of this off in some of our other sessions, where we talked about mitigating risk. We talked about making sure that you research the markets that you are going to trade with really well and thoroughly, and that you had a good idea of the regulatory landscape there, as well as the kind of political, social and economic status of that country. So this, if you don't have access to that presentation, some of it does kind of coincide with this, so I'm sure Sam would issue the recording and the slides to you. But in terms of looking at the UK and global sectors that are really reliant on those resilient supply chains and that have probably been hit quite hard throughout, particularly the COVID pandemic. If you look at food and drink, so the UK imports half of its food, and we see something like 80+% of fresh fruit come in from the EU. So we're highly dependent on Spain and the Netherlands for vegetables and fruit. And so we have relied on that frictionless trade that we've had as part of the EU trading bloc. The mining sector as well, that's heavily reliant on global supply chains for the likes of machinery, equipment and components, as well as the outputs of raw materials to its customers around the world. So that's another sector that's heavily reliant on those resilient supply chains. Obviously, electronics. I think the spread of COVID made one thing crystal clear across the kind of technology, automotive, electronics, pharmaceuticals, a whole load of them, that supply chains lead back to China as being the principal global provider of those kinds of materials and components. So I think companies have started to recognise the risk of over-dependence on China to their national industries, and I think COVID has just highlighted that. Like I say, quality of product has increased dramatically in China, and it's still a wonderful place to source goods from, but I think COVID has probably made companies think about having fallbacks and having other suppliers that they can call upon and not just put all their eggs in one basket. Textiles is another one. Textiles has been hit well, I don't think we appreciate the full extent of how textiles will be impacted by EU exit, because of certain they're very reliant on triangulation of trade to do with VAT for shipping of raw materials to factories around the EU. Probably a little bit too complicated to go into today, but it's certainly a very cost-effective, cost-sensitive sector. Sorry, so. The fashion industry as a whole has to be really quick to respond to shifts in global markets and trading conditions. And I think, when we saw the US-China trade war and those kind of trade tensions and those production costs go up in China, textile and garment manufacturers were already looking to shift their manufacturing operations to other lower cost countries. So we've seen production shift to Vietnam, for example, where the labour costs are significantly cheaper. And then automotive. So, COVID and the recent US-China trade war, I think it's pointing to the fact that the supply chain in automotive is just not sustainable long term. The most vulnerable companies that rely on, solely on China for parts, it's that vulnerability linked to the disruption of supply chains that actually threatens the existence of those companies in that automotive sector. So, the current state of supply for that particular sector and that over dependence on China is just not sustainable in the long term. But they're kind of like just a couple of sectors where we see they have mastered global supply chain management and are using it in anger. And some of them are more cost sensitive than others. So any disruption to that supply or any kind of cost increases or anything like that, or any barriers to trade that are introduced, are going to have a dramatic effect on their existence in the market and their competitiveness moving forward. So looking at regulatory compliance, so where we've talked a lot about regulatory compliance and we've touched on certain parts as we've gone through EU exit, but there is there's a level of compliance to or a level of regulatory compliance required to trade with the EU. But if you think if you're then trading with other blocks and other countries around the world, then that's increased tenfold and probably even more than that. So where we're trading with those countries, with those companies in different countries, we have to make sure that we are abiding by that local regulation. And I've just, listed some of the sources of that here. So, we'd need to scrutinise those bilateral trade agreements, and, source the kind of regulatory requirements in that country, which we touched on when we were talking about mitigating risk a few weeks back. But we need to have, as part of our research, our due diligence, we need to understand what the regulatory landscape is on those countries that we're going to be sourcing from or selling into. So things to consider really. We talked a bit about emerging markets in terms of their rapid growth, their explosive growth, and they're posing opportunities for supply and for sourcing that just didn't exist before. But those emerging markets pose considerations around that regulation, and that dictates how companies can trade and how they can do business. We've obviously seen a lot when we talked about EU exit over recent months that it's already quite complicated, but obviously it's increased, it's amplified when you're looking globally. So where companies are bringing raw materials or finished products into markets, they have to contend with that complex array of import requirements. And it's incumbent on the company to have a kind of formal process for identifying and responding to those import and export requirements to make sure that any regulations that are stipulated are actually met, and that they're met consistently across the organisation. So many organisations will benefit from implementing something like how do you say, almost like a database or a framework that allows them to perform a range of functions. So classifying products across all businesses, making sure that all of the regulatory requirements, that they're stored centrally, that they're compliant and they're controlled, making sure that all of the bill of materials are maintained, all that kind of stuff. There needs to be a kind of proper approach to it, a systematic approach when you're dealing with import and export in global supply chain management. Obviously, there is a level of supplier integrity and social responsibility. So many consumers have been especially vocal of late about issues relating to worker exploitation, additives in foods, fair trade practices, and so on. And they kind of all fall under the umbrella of corporate social responsibility. So where stakeholders are demanding, probably more than ever, companies to be more transparent about the social impact of their business practices, then it's incumbent on the company to make sure that they are that there is a level of integrity and social responsibility, and that's reported on. So things like employee related human rights, anti-corruption and bribery matters, conflict materials, and other things that could come to rise in terms of designing the global supply chain, the actual global supply chain. Environmental responsibility is another one that comes into play. So a big part in supply chain compliance. So government agencies will issue regulations that companies have to adhere to avoid significant impacts on their business. So when you think about the complex regulatory environment, it pays to have that centralised approach for identifying and assessing the changes or additions to regulations, as well as their impact on your company and your supply chain, to make sure that you're proactive in your identification of those responsibilities and also your execution in order to comply. Product and safety integration as well. So, obtaining safety certification is critical for manufacturers selling products globally. And we've discussed this at length with the European CE mark and UK CA mark. So certification and product testing has become more stringent in recent years. So there's a large array of agencies and regulatory bodies that oversee that product safety and certification and testing. So companies that are operating, a global supply chain need to make sure that they are they have tracking, and that they're managing those required certifications and providing the right level of supporting documentation to make sure that the products that they're placing on the market are compliant with all applicable regulations. And that's quite a challenge to get that basis in place, but then obviously it needs continuous monitoring after that point. And then security. So the vulnerability of global supply chains was a focus of intense scrutiny following the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers. So that actually led to the launch of CTPAT, which is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, which has since launched a kind of raft of global trusted trader programs like the Authorised Economic Operator, AEO, program here in the UK, where there's specific focus on the safety and security of supply chains, as well as the customs compliance piece as well. And I think, as supply chains become more tech savvy, there's obviously an increased threat of both digital and digital nature as well as physical nature. So as part of your kind of robust compliance program, there needs to be something in there that monitors those cyber security threats, for example, and risks. And then technical regulations. So, can I say about those really? If you think about it, quite often you're going to require full disclosure to ensure, full disclosure of ingredients and formulations and so on, to make sure that products are labelled correctly and that compliance processes are adhered to and so on. And that can be a challenge for some companies where they don't want to disclose that level of detail. So it's something to bear in mind. Labour and employment. So companies obviously have a continued responsibility to source products that support fair wages and treatment of employees and so on, as well as safe facilities. So companies that are working with supply chains, global supply chains, should be continually working to ensure that those supply chains reflect the highest ethical standards, if you like. Logistics and distribution. So obviously there's been dynamic shifts in consumer behaviour over recent years, and brands like Amazon, for example, and its Prime service have given rise to this consumer that expects things yesterday, not just right now, but expects things yesterday. So that delivery pressure is requiring logistics networks and the whole supporting infrastructure to respond to that kind of thing. And this is where the goalposts seem to be moving daily. So it's really important for companies that have a decent understanding of their third parties, their logistics, so their carriers, their 3PLs and so on, and make sure that, where they're compliant, that their partners are also, so that level of compliance and those values are experienced throughout the whole supply chain. In terms of sustainability, so it's become a big focal point, because we see, I mentioned the figure earlier on of 90% of companies' environmental impact is down to their global supply chain. So really it's a question of what can be done. So importantly, you can't accomplish anything, you can't improve anything if you don't have full visibility of it. So shockingly few companies have actually mapped their full global supply chain, but you really need to do that because they're more complex than ever. So by mapping the entire global supply chain, you can then identify impacts and risks and drivers of waste. And by having that kind of helicopter view, it can help you understand the environmental and the social and the economic challenges that the global supply chain is facing. So you need to have that visibility, and that happens through that mapping exercise. Then there's a require to educate and change mindset. So some measures to enhance sustainability require not only procedural changes, but also cultural shifts as well, and behavioural changes. So a really important part of achieving sustainability is getting that buy-in from within your own company and then from within the supply chain as well. And as with anything sustainability based, there's always an education curve, and there's always an agreement in principle, but then there can be a reluctance to adapt and reality. So there's an education piece that needs to happen there, and then encourage that and assist that kind of adoption of that new mindset upstream. So, you know, that sustainability in global supply chain can't be obtained unilaterally. You need to support and cooperate all the way back upstream. And obviously, as a smaller company, you may not have the kind of persuasive power over your chain like a larger player, but you do have the ability to influence those practices. You know, you can perform audits, you can enact codes of conduct that can encourage suppliers to kind of increase their sustainability efforts. We should also be willing to assist them with that as well. Obviously, leveraging technology, so continued advances in technology are providing organisations with the ability to analyse and tweak and measure and optimise operational processes like inventory management, order and distribution management, and transportation management. So, you know, leverage technology to understand where those sustainability gains can be achieved. And then collaboration. So, you know, individual efforts aren't going to solve complex supply chain issues at a kind of, you know, company level or even sector level. So many competing companies, it's not uncommon for them to share portions of the supply chain and collaborate on efforts to establish sustainable practices that can actually ultimately benefit everyone. So it feels a little bit weird and a little bit counterintuitive to work with a rival company, but by combining efforts, that's the only way that we can really drive sustainability. And then reverse logistics, so there's focus on that. So with the rise in sustainability and the focus on that, then reverse logistics is one of the next focuses for both retailers and manufacturers. So if you think in a 100% circular economy, the return flow is equal to the volume of the original transaction. And we saw with the EU circular economy package that was announced last year that's a perfect example of regulation impacting this drive and kind of, you know, backing up this drive. And then build on success. So, you know, we're very used to tracking financial objectives within the company, so profit and revenue, but we should really be developing sustainability objectives and tracking their success as well. Advantages of global supply chains. So there are many, and there are probably a number of disadvantages as well. But if you think about it, you've got expanded sourcing opportunities. So obviously a true global market offers you as a business opportunities to secure a diverse selection of workers, materials, and finished goods, if you like. And that larger selection often means that you have the opportunity to select higher quality or conversely lower cost options. I am a firm believer in any kind of global trade enables you to develop a much broader perspective on business. So global trade makes you think very differently. It changes your perspective. You know, once you gain greater cultural awareness, that can boost diversity and inclusion in your own company, but it can also be a driver for innovation as well. So a broader perspective, which is brought about through global trade, can lead to a new way to solve problems. Greater variety. So where you're operating in a commoditized sector, if you like, or market, and you need to differentiate your offering, then global supply chains can work wonders. So you have greater choice and more options to set yourself apart from other companies. So obviously, you know, they allow you to stretch the possibilities, reaching goods you wouldn't ordinarily be able to offer your customers if you were just sourcing locally. Lower costs. This is often a big driver for global supply chain. Obviously, you have to incur freight costs and insurance, and we've talked about valuation build-up and so on of goods over recent weeks. And you also have to factor in shipping time when sourcing globally. But even once that's factored in, quite often there can be significant savings from purchasing goods from those overseas countries. So whether you're buying in components that you're going to finish in the UK, or whether you're planning, or whether you're buying in finished goods or you're buying in raw materials, there can quite often be significant cost efficiencies through global sourcing. And obviously, if you're willing to keep a close eye on those exchange rate fluctuations, then you can further work it to your advantage as well. International customers, so obviously supply chains, international supply chains aren't just about sourcing goods, they're about where you sell your goods to, so where you ship your goods to. If you had more customers, could you sell more product? The likelihood is yes, of course you could. So it's a big wide world out there. So you know, those global supply chains open up other market opportunities to actually sell your finished goods into. And then obviously higher volume, so particularly for retail sales, one of the factors that limits how much you can sell is the amount of money you can invest in purchasing in inventory. If you can buy more, in many cases you'll be able to sell more. So accessing lower costs and more efficient production capabilities means that you can create or deliver higher volume sales for your companies. Okay, so they're basically the advantages. And in terms of some of the drawbacks, so larger scale management issues. So the opportunity to grow businesses goes hand in hand with the issue of greatly increased supply chain complexity when it comes to actually managing that. So that has to be factored in. So, you know, inventory issues and distribution issues are high on the list of problems encountered when you're kind of going global. But as I've said in various different presentations that we've done before, where there's a risk or where there's a limitation, there's always something, you know, a risk mitigation strategy that can be implemented there. We have to consider longer lead times. So whilst production time can be quick, the lead times can often be much longer because the goods require shipping, which can add to the lead time. So you just have to build that into your planning. Reputational risk as well, that can put off you know, some companies from moving towards global supply. So obviously if you haven't done sufficient research, you haven't done sufficient due diligence, then your exposure to brand and financial risk can all be increased with global supply chains. Fluctuations in exchange rates, as I said before, they can work to your advantage, but you really need to keep your eye on the ball because those global markets are going to be more susceptible to those regional fluctuations and influences that can impact those exchange rates. Challenges in communication, always there with international trade, and we become better and better at dealing with it the longer we've been in it. There obviously has to be careful consideration of terminology and the type of communication methods that are used to interface with those global partners, to make sure that any information or instructions that are given are interpreted correctly and carried out correctly. You do have a level of increased risk exposure. So again, as we said a few weeks ago, having that careful research into social and political and economic status of that supply country will help mitigate your risk there. So, you know, plan. I mean, Myanmar is a perfect example. I've been talking to companies for the last couple of years about what a fantastic prospect Myanmar is for some of our construction-based industries, with this $60 billion worth of investment in infrastructure that they need to spend in the next 10 years. And yet now we probably wouldn't be looking to invest in Myanmar anytime soon with a recent military coup. Information collection challenges. So with different aspects of your supply chain scattered kind of all over the world, you've obviously got increasingly complex processes for getting products to customers. So that data collection and that oversight can be significant challenges. And so where those kind of big data analytics are helping some supply chain managers tackle those issues, it's still a large problem that's emerged alongside this trend towards globalization. Obviously, loss of control. So due to the distance, the time differences, all of those kind of things, the language barriers, then you know, that working relationship can be difficult to manage, and communicating the technical aspects of the production process can be a little bit of a challenge, and those quality issues can be difficult to manage again. But again, it's just a case of planning and working at it and developing those relationships, and that trust ultimately in those suppliers. Legal issues, so kind of linked to regulation. Where you're operating across borders, it means you're operating in countries that very likely have different laws and different regulations, almost certainly have different laws and regulations. So you know, secret product details and formulations may be less safe in some markets, as I said earlier, that have less stringent intellectual property laws than in other markets. And similarly, you might be working with a factory in one region that has very different employment laws to a factory that you're working with in another region. So a few of the drawbacks in terms of impacts and influences. So, you know, we can't ignore COVID. Without a doubt, that's, you know, had the biggest impact on supply chain. So whereas in previous years, businesses might have struggled with component shortages or global trade uncertainty, nothing in comparison to COVID. And in many respects, COVID has actually amplified certain situations. So, you know, as we saw worldwide lockdowns and new waves of the virus and so on, and you've seen enterprises large and small that have had to navigate their way through really, really turbulent conditions. So that has been absolutely, you know, very, very COVID has impacted massively on global supply. We've seen component supply constraints. So 2017, 2018, we saw electronics demand dramatically outstrip capacity. So we saw extended lead times on commodity devices like resistors and diodes and all those kind of wonderful things that I couldn't possibly identify if somebody kind of like pointed them out to me. But we saw, you know, those kind of lead times extend significantly. Demand expansion, so consumer demand for electronics in particular has been fueled massively by the pandemic. So as many schools and offices switch to home working and home learning, then there's been a massive demand for electronic devices. And, you know, we're not seeing that change anytime soon, that electronics market continues to outgrow the kind of global economy. We've seen global trade and tariff uncertainty. So obviously tariff uncertainty has never really been something we've had to think that much about in the UK, because so much of our supply chain is within the EU and we've had that free circulation of goods. But obviously EU exit has put that kind of tariff and non-tariff barrier discussion, it's brought it to the fore. Labour shortages, so like everything in international trade, labour shortages in global supply chain management are prevalent in the UK, although there's an increasing number of universities that are offering suitable qualifications and apprenticeships and so on. So we, you know, but it's definitely a side or an industry that needs more investment and more talent coming in. What else? I'm just conscious of time. We see higher labour costs. So another factor driving pricing and availability issues in recent years has been those labour cost increases in China. So China salaries, or the average annual wage, rose by nearly 63% between 2011 and 2016. So we're already seeing some companies looking to source alternative suppliers. Some have actually reached out to Eastern Europe because they believe that they have comparable salaries to some Chinese manufacturers. But also we're seeing manufacturing switch to Vietnam as well. So just conscious of time, I'm just going to move on a little bit. So we obviously the impact of EU exit has been significant. I don't think we've fully realised the effect of it yet. We're still very, very early days, but obviously we see the imposition of tariffs now because we've got no free circulation of goods. So we're bound by the specific rules of origin and the trade and cooperation agreement that allow the flow of EU-UK goods between the two trading bloc, or the two parties. But those third country goods that come into the UK or into the EU and are subsequently re-exported into the other party will face duties. Obviously, we're working with dual regulatory systems now, so whereby the UK has taken regulatory control back in much of its industry. Then, depending on where companies are placing goods, they're having to comply with two different sets of regulation and abide by two different sets of regulatory bodies. We're seeing more, obviously, full customs controls at the border, we're seeing all of the customs formalities that we would see on third country goods, which obviously adds to the cost and also adds to the time. And we're seeing also in terms of a backlog in supply. We're still seeing, certainly with some of the fast parcel operators, there's still massive delays on getting product out because they're working through the backlog from January. So there are definitely disruptions in the supply chain between the UK and the EU. VAT, the fact that we've left the EU VAT directive, it means that we no longer have that triangulation that has worked really well for us in terms of our supply chains within the EU. Lead times have increased, quite often we've got these customs formalities that require us to pre-notify and have pre-authorizations before we can ship goods. We have to obtain certificates and licenses, all these kind of things that we've not had to consider before when we've had our supply chains within the EU. And I think ultimately, if I had a penny for every client that has said to us on the various EU exit support programs that we run for the growth hubs that it seems like the EU has become more complex and burdensome and expensive to deal with than the rest of the world, I would be, sunning myself in the Maldives by now, because that is the perception. Genuinely, that's the perception, that the EU at the moment, as it stands, it is just too complex to deal with. And, should we be looking at other markets? And that really saddens me to hear that from clients. In terms of the impact of COVID, just running through some of this quickly. So obviously, we couldn't talk about COVID and its impact without talking about the impact on China. So, if you think about it, Apple has some 10,000 direct employees in China, with almost all of the company's flagship iPhone products being made in that country. And then you've got US car manufacturer Ford relies on them as well. So, if you think about China's share of global exports, it's more than doubled from just under 6% in 2003 to nearly 13% in 2018. So, we rely on that country massively. And so when they experienced, those devastating impacts of COVID, that had a ripple effect on the rest of the global economy, even though some of the other countries hadn't actually felt those, devastating impacts at that time. The kind of hygiene practices that we've had to all take on board, and the whole social distancing and so on. There's a query on how long that goes on for, and are we, forever changed, and how does that impact on that supply chain efficiency? Could that represent longer term disruption? But on the other side, there's other people that think that, some of these practices will lead to less minor illnesses like, the common cold and flu that are responsible for a staggering number of sick days across the UK and globally. There's been a kind of broadening and localization of supplier choices. So price is always the determining factor when it comes to choosing suppliers, and that kind of globalization has meant that importing materials and goods from the other side of the world is often more affordable than sourcing them from locations right in your doorstep. But companies have been forced to kind of react and respond quite quickly, and look at alternatives throughout the COVID pandemic. And some of those agreements and some of those new relationships and new supply may just continue. We've seen massive increase in the use of e-commerce. So obviously people staying at home, which we all have for pretty much a year now, and not moving around that much, has meant that we've relied heavily on the e-commerce sector. Obviously we've seen the non-essential retail sector close down in the UK for huge swathes of time. So companies that never used to have websites have quickly set them up to allow consumers to have access to their goods. And there's been recent research to suggest that there's been a 209% increase in e-transactions amongst sellers and buyers in last April and May alone, as the pandemic started to really take grip. So we're seeing shifts. COVID has resulted in shifts in the way that we buy things and the way that we sell things that we may remain permanently changed if potentially as a result of this, and some of it will be for the better. In terms of future trends, so we're going to see more automation. So while the world deals with more global problems than ever before, then the stresses on mechanical efficiency is ever increasing. So having that end-to-end pragmatic use of kind of automation is needed to drive those scalable efficiencies. So it's not that automation replaces human labour, it shouldn't be perceived like that, but instead it kind of frees up human labour to focus on those more critical decision-making tasks. So we're seeing an increased use of robotics, artificial intelligence and smart contracts. Blockchain, so that's, you know, for many years been touted as the next big thing for the supply chain industry. While the implementation hasn't been as fast as was expected, it's definitely carved a niche for itself. And, you know, we'll just see that continue basically. In terms of other things to mention, so smart warehouses, so the overall push in the supply chain seems to be towards making smarter warehouses. So the term smarter implies better, a more efficient way of doing things with the aid of technology. But the concept talks of warehouses, so smarter warehouses, actually encompass the whole or the entire supply chain end to end. So that's a really exciting thing to be watching. Flexible supply chain, so dozens of factors work across the supply chain end to end. So traditionally, any of these factors could hamper the entire supply chain and cause huge losses. But today, that supply chain industry is moving towards greater flexibility. So a certain agility is sought that could absorb minor issues and foresee future upheavals and so on. Just rushing through, because I really do want to cover off some questions with you. What else? Stronger collaboration in the supply chain process, so that kind of solid procurement practices and stronger relationships with suppliers should absolutely be seen as a priority, and certainly will be in terms of future trends. Circular supply chain, so the term linear supply chain refers to the conventional concept where goods flow linearly, so from raw materials to finished products. But those modern logistics practices focus now on the circular supply chain concept, so involving the use of previously used products as raw materials, which obviously ties into the whole sustainability argument. Just moving on slightly, because I really don't have that many slides left. In terms of optimization, so, you know, what can we do? Well, you know, flexibility is obviously key. So agility has always been important in our supply chains. And this needs to really feed into the next generation supply chains. So we should be able to react to sudden changing circumstances in the operating environment, and COVID, you know, EU exit, we were able to plan a little bit more for that, although seeing the pain that we're experiencing now questions how much we did plan. But COVID has come as a shock, and it's jumped up to bite us, and so we need to make sure that we have that flexibility in the supply chain and that resilience in the supply chain to cope with any kind of unpredictable or devastating incident. You know, and that could be COVID, like a global pandemic, or it could be a natural disaster, all sorts of stuff, or, you know, in some of those emerging markets, some of that political and economic instability. Supply chain digitization, so that really encompasses all efforts to integrate corporate systems into one unified whole, if you like. So those digital technologies are really, really important, and they'll continue to be a priority moving forward. I suppose if you think about digitization, the PwC, I read an article from them a few weeks back. They refer to it as kind of smart, efficient supply chain ecosystem that breaks down all of those silos and creates that important transparency and enhances that responsiveness. And so that's what digitization can do. Speed of delivery, so, you know, that will continue to be more and more critical for supply chains, being able to respond very quickly to demands and make sure that you can secure quick delivery for retailers and other key members of that supply chain. Global reach, so long are the days when companies could locally limit the delivery of their products, because we've got the internet, we've got e-commerce and so on. So our supply chains need to be big enough to cope with globalization, to cope with our global trade. So you need to understand how global hubs work, for example, so that you can be competitive in those farther flung territories where you can still get goods to your consumers and to your customers fast, even though you're far away from them. So global hubs are imperative in terms of optimizing the supply chain. Optimized inventory. So the trick with efficient inventory management is that you should have just the right amount of stock in the warehouse at the right time. Obviously, having too much ties up cash flow and so on, and can lead to issues around unsold stock and expired stock. So I can't think of the word I want to say there. Anyway, it'll come back to me. So optimized inventory, so getting that balance right is really important. Going green and being sustainable. We're going to see just more and more focus on this. So, you know, having that green supply chain that doesn't impact on the environment negatively, and doesn't put you in a position whereby you're going to be penalised for not having that kind of focus, you know, because we are going to see more regulation come down the line that that forces us to go down this route. Proactive strategy. So supply chains should be really proactive in the case of disruption. So you should be constantly preempting things, you know, any kind of sudden changes, any kind of potential disasters, and really using that data that you have to do that modelling, and that research gives you that insight and knowledge and helps you prepare. And then innovation. So every supply chain has to embrace that innovation in whichever, you know, form it comes, but specifically technology. So if you're incorporating the latest technology in your supply chains, you can ensure that you stay competitive and that you can keep that service excellence as you go through. And I think that's it. And you know what? I've got about 2 minutes for questions, but if everybody's fine to go over, I certainly am. I did think I'd be finished sooner than that, Richard and Sam. I do apologise.
Andrea, always fascinating, always good value. I think sometimes you're just trying to, like one of those promotional packs in the supermarket, you know, it's 50% free. It's always more than, so I think that's what the challenge is. There's only one question in the Q&A at the moment, so let's just address that one. Are there any good tools that can help with global supply chain mapping?
Oh, there are a number of different software vendors and solutions out there. I would just do a search. You'll find a number of US sites in particular that might have done evaluation of some of them, so they might give you that insight. So I would do that search on global supply chain mapping and technology and see what that comes up with.
Sure. Is there any that you've used or you've heard? Not
that spring to mind. No, I couldn't. If you ask me about custom software, I'd be like, oh yeah, this, and this, but not global supply chain mapping.
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm just trying to sort of help the individual if they've clearly got a need for it immediately.
I think you need Dr. Google and a little bit of research around that.
Okay, fair enough. And that's the only question. Just if I was asking, you know, from the webinars that you've been doing, is there any, are there 2 or 3 really big recommendations that you would give our participants?
Obviously, depending on the nature of their business, so the products or the services that they're doing, I think where they are supplying goods, I think it would pay to spend the time looking at the flow of goods, where you know, where previously they've sourced goods from third countries and they've brought them into the UK and then re-exported them to the EU. Is that practical to continue doing that? So do they need to look at the flow of the goods where they're importing goods and they're perhaps not doing any kind of substantial processing to them? Is there a better way of limiting the costs or lowering the costs, or, you know, making sure that they're not overpaying duty and that their customer in the EU isn't overpaying duty? It's difficult, really, to be honest, Richard. It's there's so many pain points out there at the moment, if I'm totally honest. VAT is a big one. We know origin is a big one. You know, we've lost origin is complicated enough to navigate for the purposes of the trade and cooperation agreement. But then if you think we can no longer count EU raw material as part of our origin when we're trading with other countries outside of the EU, we're left thinking, what does our preferential trade landscape look like? And, you know, are our products going to be more expensive longer term for going into those countries? So origin and VAT remains overwhelmingly the two most complicated issues, as do things like, you'll know very well with the food and drink sector, those sanitary and phytosanitary controls.
Yeah, people sourcing vets seems to be the big challenge. They keep asking me. Yeah.
There are people that will do very well out of Brexit, and I think vets must be one of them actually at the moment. They're very much in demand. But I mean, nobody wants to profit from something like this. But yeah, there are certain professionals and certain sectors that are overstretched at the minute because of the burden that the EU exit is placing on them. You know, customs clearance, you can't get a new customs clearance agent for love nor money because they're just at capacity. And it's a bit frustrating because it's, you know, we saw this coming, we knew it was coming, so, you know, why aren't we better prepared? But hey.
Okay. Look, Andrea, I think the best is to actually draw it to a close now, in the sense of you know, we are, as you say, running over. I think we've answered the questions that were there. If anybody's got any burning ones, they can obviously get in touch with us or with yourself and follow it that way. I think, therefore, I'd just like to wrap it up and thank you for the 11 sessions that you've done and the value and the help that you've given on a really critical set of issues that have impacted, well, I can't think of a business practically that hasn't been impacted one way or another, even if it's only the cost of products that they're sourcing via importers or whatever. So I think there's a huge value that you've given to the economy throughout the arc. I'd like to thank the delegates that have been here and the participants today and stayed with us. Please have a look on the webinar page in front of you here. It says the contact details in your local region. All of them are set up to give you specific and tailored advice, and therefore please do follow up with them. I need to emphasize that this has been recorded and the slides will be available after this on websites. So if you do need to go back and refer to anything, then you can. And finally, this may be the end of the EU exit, the Brexit webinars, but there are with Andrea, but there are a couple which are coming up, a couple of which are being done by Grant Thornton, I think, and there will be webinars running on normal sort of general issues in terms of finance, marketing, etc. Through each of the hubs. So please do use the resource that we have to the fullest. Last again, thanks to Sam for running all of these webinars for us.
Sam.
Great value. Okay, thanks now. Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.